Why was the post-World War II world order established in this way? This world didn't build itself. The money you earn and use today, the system you work within, the debt quietly accumulating in the background of every economy, none of these are accidents. All of it was deliberately shaped by people who lived through a time when the world nearly destroyed itself. Especially after World War II, the global order wasn't built to be fair or perfect, as many assume. It was built to eliminate chaos. Back then, no one was asking, what is the most efficient system? The real question was, how do we make sure things never get this bad again? Because in the 1940s, the issue wasn't growth or prosperity, it was survival. Europe was devastated, cities were gone, economies had collapsed. Asia was torn apart by war. Currencies had lost their value, trade had come to a halt. And on top of that, the trauma of the Great Depression was still fresh. People had seen what financial collapse looked like, and they never wanted to experience it again. That's why the decision makers of that time came to a very clear conclusion. Uncontrolled markets and collapsing monetary systems don't just trigger economic crises, they radicalize societies and eventually lead to war. So this wasn't just about economics, it was directly about maintaining peace. With that fear in mind, even before the war had ended, a group of policymakers began asking a crucial question. Rebuilding political order isn't enough. What if we need to redesign the financial system from the ground up? When they gathered at Bretton Woods in 1944, what they were doing was far more than creating a monetary system. They were trying to design stability itself. These weren't theorists debating abstract ideas. These were policymakers who had witnessed collapse, feared its return, and were determined to prevent it. Their biggest fear wasn't inflation or debt, it was disorder. Because they had already seen what disorder leads to: unemployment, anger, extremism, and ultimately war. So they made several critical decisions. Currencies would no longer be left to fluctuate uncontrollably. Exchange rates would be fixed. Stability would take priority over flexibility. Nations wouldn't act entirely on their own anymore. They would commit to rules, institutions, and oversight. And most importantly, the system would be centered around the United States. This wasn't an act of generosity, it was the reality of the time. After the war, the U.S. was the only major economy that remained strong, with a solid industrial base, massive gold reserves, and global influence. So the dollar became the core of the system, and other currencies were tied to it. In theory, this would create a stable and predictable world. In practice, it created a hierarchy. But at the time, no one saw that as a problem, because the alternative was far worse. To support this system, institutions like the IMF and the World Bank were established. Their goal wasn't to generate growth, but to contain crises. And for a while, it worked. In the decades after the war, economies grew, trade expanded, and the middle class emerged. To many, the system felt like a miracle. But that miracle depended on very specific conditions. Capital flows were restricted, governments actively managed markets, and the U.S. absorbed the costs of maintaining global stability. In other words, everything depended on a delicate balance, and that balance was never meant to last forever. Over time, the system began to strain under the weight of its own success. Trade expanded, dollars spread across the globe, and the promise that every dollar could be converted into gold became impossible to maintain. In 1971, when the U.S. broke the dollar's link to gold, the rules of the game fundamentally changed. The world moved from a system backed by something tangible to one based entirely on trust. But this shift wasn't presented as a revolution. It was framed as a technical adjustment. And that framing mattered because people accepted the change without fully realizing what it meant. After that, the dollar found a new anchor in energy, particularly oil. Global trade continued to be conducted in dollars, and countries needed dollars to purchase energy, the lifeblood of modern economies. This created a constant global demand for the currency. So instead of collapsing, the system adapted. But with that adaptation, the nature of finance also changed. Money was no longer just a medium of exchange, it became a tool of power. Debt was no longer a flaw in the system, it became a core feature. Financial markets began growing faster than the real economy, and central banks shifted from passive observers to active managers of the system. At this point, many people make a mistake. They assume this was all part of a deliberate plan or a conspiracy. In reality, it was more about the system evolving through its own incentives. Once physical constraints on money disappeared, governments gained flexibility, but also became more dependent. It became easier to delay crises, but each delay made the next one bigger. By the time the 2008 financial crisis hit, the response was already predictable: more money, more intervention, more support. The system survived again, but at a cost. Debt levels increased, asset prices surged, and inequality widened. What we're experiencing today isn't a collapse. The system still works, but not under the conditions it was originally built for. It now operates in a more complex, more fragile, and more dependent environment. That's why modern crises don't feel clear-cut. They feel like overlapping problems, where fixing one issue quietly creates another. Because the system still follows the same core logic, prevent chaos, but now the cost of that stability is becoming more visible. And here's the most important part. This system wasn't a mistake. On the contrary, it was a rational response to an irrationally destructive period in history. But no system, no matter how well designed or well intentioned, can function perfectly forever. Stability always comes with a cost, and eventually, someone has to pay it. Sometimes through inflation, sometimes through debt, and sometimes through missed opportunities that quietly shape the future. Understanding this doesn't mean predicting collapse. It simply means understanding how the game is played. It means recognizing that money isn't neutral and the system isn't random. And once you see that, the world starts to feel less chaotic. Not because it's safer, but because you finally understand what's actually happening. If this video gave you a new perspective, don't forget to subscribe and hit the like button. Your support helps more content like this reach you. And remember, history holds the answers.